Well, thanks everybody for coming. I am going to talk to you about some other research that we've been doing in my lab. But first, let me tell you again how much I've enjoyed the 48 hours that I've had in Zagreb. You live in an amazingly beautiful place, and I've enjoyed every minute of it, and also getting a chance to get to know some of the colleagues here and at the Pilar Institute. So it's been wonderful. What I'm going to do today is talk about a topic that is somewhat similar to one of the things I talked about yesterday. Yesterday I talked a little bit about mate choice in animals and humans. And when I introduced it, I said that one of the interests in my lab that we've had for a very long time are these topics that touch on both biology and psychology. And what we're going to talk about today is another one of those topics. Basically, we're going to look at aggressive behavior, which is something that evolutionary biologists have thought about and researched for a very, very long time. But it's only recently that a particular aspect of aggressive behavior has become the focus of folks who study evolution and behavior. And that is these winner and loser effects that I'm going to talk to you about today. So basically, what I want to do is first give you an overview of this topic and give you some definitions of what winner effects are and what loser effects are, what dominance hierarchies are, and the way that behavioral evolutionary people think about aggression. Then I will show you some experimental work that we've done to look and see whether these winner and loser effects have impacts on the way that aggression plays out in groups, the way that dominance hierarchies form. And then I'll tell you some theoretical work that we've done on winning, losing, and dominance hierarchies. If you go into the literature in evolution and behavior and you are interested in aggressive behavior, most of the work that's out there looks at a relatively small number of factors that might influence how likely you are to win a fight or to lose a fight, to enter into a fight, to leave a fight. So there's a lot of work on size of the animals, and like you might expect, larger animals tend to be more aggressive, they tend to get into more fights, they tend to win more fights. Nothing especially surprising. Size really matters when it comes to aggression. Strength also really matters. Strength and size are often tightly correlated, but they don't have to be. It's not always the case that the largest individuals are the strongest. But there's a lot of work demonstrating that strength is important in terms of understanding who wins fights and who loses fights. Another thing that you'll see in the behavioral evolutionary literature is a lot on weapons. And that might be anything from antlers in mammals to the equivalent sorts of structures in beetles and other insects, or it might be spines or any kind of weaponry. And clearly, weaponry plays an important role in species where you see it and there's aggressive behavior. Another variable that people look at is condition. So for example, whether or not an animal has had food recently or not, or was sick recently or not. And condition 2 is a pretty good predictor of who's going to win fights. Hungry, sick individuals tend to lose fights, and so on. All of those first 4 that we talked about, those are typically referred to as intrinsic qualities of an organism. And in a moment, we're going to talk about extrinsic qualities of an organism. But by intrinsic, I mean that how big you are is a function of something about the organism itself. It doesn't matter what any other organism does or how big it is. Your size is your size. It's not affected directly by what other organisms do. And the same thing with your strength and your weaponry and your condition. These are things that are sort of inside of the animal in a sense. They're not affected directly in any real way by what other animals might have as their strength or size and weaponry. Yours is what it is. Recently, people who study behavior and evolution have begun to focus more on some of these things that are referred to as extrinsic factors and how important they might be in determining who goes into fights, who wins fights, and who loses fights. There are basically 4 types of extrinsic factors. I'm going to focus on 2 of them, but I'm just going to give you a sense of what all 4 of them are. When we talk about winner effects, I'll spend a little bit more time on winner and loser effects in a minute, but the basic idea here is that winner effects mean that winning a fight makes you more likely to win your next fight. Okay? It's not just that you're a good fighter, and it's not just that you win. It's that when you win, it increases the probability that you win the next time. So having won an aggressive interaction with somebody else increases your probability of winning your next aggressive interaction. And a loser effect occurs when losing a fight makes you more likely to lose your next fight. Not just that you lose fights a lot, but that when you lose a fight, it increases the chances that the next time you fight, you're going to lose as well. And we can measure those sorts of things. We can look at the probability of winning a fight if you haven't had any recent experience, and we could look at the probability of winning a fight after you've just won one, or losing a fight after you've just lost one. But these have psychological implications as well. So for example, in humans, when people get on winning streaks, when a soccer team gets on a winning streak, or a baseball team gets on a winning streak, having won a few times makes you more likely to win in the future. It seems to do something psychologically, probably through hormonal effects, that change the way that you look at aggressive interactions. The other types of these extrinsic factors are what are known as bystander effects and audience effects. By bystander effects, we mean that in some animal species, individuals watch aggressive interactions between others in their group, and they use the information that they've obtained when they get into aggressive interactions. So I watch a fight between 2 individuals, and that affects how I behave when I interact with the winner of that fight. I might interact differently with the loser of the fight. I have information on what their fighting ability is by watching, and I can use that information. And the last type of extrinsic effect is what's known as an audience effect. And the audience effect occurs when individuals who are in an aggressive interaction, when they're in a fight, if they behave differently when they're watched than when they're not watched. So, for example, in things like Siamese fighting fish, if you put 2 males together and they get into a fight, they behave differently during that aggressive interaction, depending upon whether or not any females are watching. If females are watching, they expend more energy, the fights go longer, they're more aggressive. If there are no females watching, then the prize, in essence, for winning that fight is much less, and so they put less into the fight. And these are all known as extrinsic factors because they're not totally reliant on something about the organism only, about the individual only. It depends on what happens when you interact with others. Winner effects mean that after you've interacted with somebody, you're more likely to win. Loser effects mean the opposite, and these others mean what we just talked about. They all are contextual. They all depend upon what happens when you do something with somebody else. And it's only, again, recently that behavioral evolutionary people have really paid a lot of attention to these extrinsic effects, and it turns out that they're much more important than we initially thought. I'm going to not worry about the alliances and coalitions. I just want to, there are other kinds of extrinsic effects, but I'm going to focus here on these winner and loser effects, And again, more technically, we can define a winner effect as the victory at some time t, whatever that might be, increases the probability. So if you win at time t, then you're more likely to win at time t plus 1 than if you hadn't had any interaction at time t. So as the number of interactions go up, and as the number of winning interactions go up, your probability of winning goes up. Not just that you win a lot, but your probability of winning changes as a function of having won before. And similarly, we can technically define a loser effect as when you lose a fight at some time t, then at the next time, t plus 1, you're more likely to lose a fight because you lost a fight than if you hadn't just lost a fight. And again, so your probability of losing goes up with your number of losing interactions. Now, these winner and loser effects have been shown in a number of different species. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples, but before I do, let me just make it clear that even though winner and loser effects, you can kind of think of them as the opposite of one another, okay? But in fact, you can have one of those without having the other. So for example, in some species, individuals are more likely to win a fight after they've just won a fight. But they're not more likely to lose a fight after they've lost a fight. So in that species, we have only winner effects, but no loser effects. In other species, you may have loser effects, but winning doesn't change your probability of winning, so there's no winner effects. So you can have either one of those, or you can have both of them, or you can have neither of them. Right? So they've both been demonstrated in, for example, copperhead snakes, where the typical procedure is, you put two individuals together, you let them interact aggressively, and you examine whether or not the probability of winning goes up as a function of prior victories, and you look at the probability of whether the probability of losing goes up after prior losses. And in the copperhead snakes, both of those things occur. The loser effect is a little bit stronger than the winner effect, but they're both in play. You see this in bird species like these blue-footed boobies, where there's a very strong loser effect. You lose a fight, particularly among the chicks in a nest. You lose a fight, and your probability of losing really goes up after that. And you can have things like if you lose a fight, your probability of losing goes up. If you lose 2 fights in a row, your probability of losing may go up even higher. And then 3 fights in a row may have additive effects. What I'm going to talk to you about is some work that we've done on these winner and loser effects and aggression in green swordtails, a species of fish. They're not particularly, they're probably about 5 centimeters long, very easy to work with in the laboratory, and they have very, very clear aggressive interactions that occur between pairs of individuals. So you can basically sit with a video recorder and tape what these individuals are doing, and you can get information on who attacks and who wins a fight by just playing the video in very slow motion and knowing which fish is which. And so they have these very, very clear aggressive interactions. And if you let this go on for probably a few hours, what'll happen is they'll settle into a very, very clear hierarchy where one of the individuals is dominant to the other one, and the dominant individual will just swim around the tank anywhere they want, and the other individual will be sort of cowering, hiding in a corner somewhere, trying not to interact anymore. But until that point, they're constantly going through what you just saw here, and you just sit down and you write down who's attacking who, and you can really get lots and lots of information about aggressive interactions. They form dominance hierarchies, so what you saw there were a pair of individuals, but you can put 4 individuals or 6 individuals together and basically watch all of them interact the way that you just watched that pair. You just have to go through your videotapes more often. You can get all the information, and eventually, again, on a matter of maybe a few hours to a few days, things will settle down. And what I mean is that it will be very, very clear who is the top individual in a hierarchy. That is, who can defeat anybody else when they fight them. Then there'll be a second-ranked individual who will lose to the first-ranked individual but be able to defeat anybody below them. And every rank in the group will be clear, and you can just know that by looking at who's attacking who and who's winning those fights. They'll settle down into a very, very clear hierarchy. We didn't do work on this, but there's all kinds of work that's been done on the hormonal effects of fighting in this species. So we know something about hormones and aggression in this species. And they're really, really easy to manipulate in a laboratory. Just like the guppies that I talked about yesterday were very, very nice for looking at mate choice. These fish, they don't require a lot of space. You could have a group of 4 or 6 of them in a space this big. And so you could have 20 groups interacting and not have to use more than maybe 2 of these tables, and they're very easy to keep in the laboratory. Now, we and others have demonstrated in work that I'm not going to go into in detail here, both the presence of winner and loser effects in this species. So in green swordtails, if you win, it increases the probability of winning in the future. If you lose, it increases the probability of losing in the future. The work in this area has sort of gotten to the point now where that's not especially interesting anymore. So initially, it was interesting just to document these effects because we just didn't know whether or not they existed in many different species. Now we do, and so showing that there's a winner and loser effect is just another example of the phenomenon in nature. Not especially interesting. It's good to know, but it's not conceptually very exciting. One of the things that's been missing so far is that all of these winner and loser effects, the way that you look at them is you pair up individuals, you let them fight, and then you see who wins. And then you pick one of them and you see, okay, if it just won, if you put them against somebody else, do they have a much higher probability of winning? And the same thing with the loser effect. You tend to look at a pair of individuals and another pair of individuals and another pair of individuals. What is missing is a sense of how these winner and loser effects might impact how hierarchies are formed within groups. So even though individuals will interact in pairs, fish 1 will be interacting with fish 2, there'll be 4 other fish that they're living with. And fish 3 will be interacting with 4, and everybody will be interacting with everybody else in pairs eventually. And they'll form this dominance hierarchy that I told you about. What we don't know is how winner and loser effects translate into anything about how dominance hierarchies are formed. So I'm going to show you an experiment that one of my students and I did on this question. Let me show you how we set up the experiment, because it's important to understand how winners and losers are chosen in this experiment. So, for example, suppose you have two of these swordtails, right? And suppose you put them together, and fish 1 wins a fight against fish 2. And then suppose you take fish 1, and you put them against fish 3. And let's say fish 1 wins again. So fish 1 won both fights. Right? There are a number of things that could be going on here. It could be that fish 1 is just a good fighter. There's something intrinsic inside about that organism, about fish 1, that makes it a good fighter. And so you put it against fish 2 and it wins, and you put it against fish 3 and it wins. Or it could be that winning against fish 2 increase the probability of winning against fish 3, so when you go against fish 3, you win. Those are 2 very different things. One is a general thing about fish 1, it's just a good fighter. The other is that it might be a good fighter, but there's also this idea that winning makes you more likely to win. And if all you do is this, you can never figure out which of those 2 possibilities is going on here. So what we do for our experiment, when we want to create individuals who have won a fight, so that we can see whether or not that influences hierarchy formation, what we do is the following. We've got a pool of swordtails. And I mean literally a pool, and also a bunch of animals that are swimming around. And they're all about the same size. So imagine a pool with like 100 individuals in it, and all the swordtails have been chosen so that they're about the same size. These are all males, all right? And we randomly go into that group, and we pick out a bunch of individuals. So let's say we pick out one of them to start with. What we do is we experimentally make them a winner. And the way that we experimentally make them a winner is we take the randomly selected fish and we put them up against a very, very small opponent. Because other work has demonstrated that if the fish are, anywhere from 10 to 20% different in size, then the larger fish will win. And every time we did this, because we chose quite small opponents, every time we did this, our randomly selected fish won, and that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to randomly select an individual and give them a winner effect, so that we don't have to worry about whether or not they're just a good fighter. We've made them experimentally have a winning experience. And like I say, because of the size difference we chose, when we did this, we kept getting our randomly selected individual to be a winner, which is what we were trying to do. Then, and we did that for, I think, 18 fish. We made 18 winners. Okay, so every time we go in there, we pull one out by randomly, we put it against a tiny opponent, it wins. Now we have 18 fish that have had experiences where they've just won a fight. Then we go back into that same pool of all the same size fish, and we randomly pick another bunch. And for every one of those, we're going to experimentally make them experience losing a fight. And the way we're going to do that is we are going to put them up against a really, really large opponent. And so they will consistently lose that fight over and over again. And so we had 18 fish now who got beaten up by this other larger opponent, which is what we were trying to do.
Only one fight? Only one fight?
Yes, only one. Well, only one fight, but not one interaction, but a certain amount of time, like 5 or 10 minutes. I can't remember exactly what. So there'll be lots of interactions, but only one of those 5 or 10 minute bouts. You could make that a variable in the experiment. And then we had, again, going back into that pool of fish, all the same size, we randomly choose another 18 fish, and these fish don't interact with anybody over the course of our experiment. So we just pull them out, and they have no experience whatsoever fighting somebody else. And we know from other work that these winning and losing effects, they tend to wear off after a couple of days. So we chose a long enough time period so that the fish here really had no experience in the recent past that would affect them. And that's what we wanted. We wanted 18 fish that had just won, experimentally made winners, 18 fish that had just been experimentally made losers, and 18 fish who hadn't had either of those. And then we formed 18 groups, and each one of the groups had one of each of the winner, loser, and the neutral, the individual who had no experience. And we put them together. We let them interact for a matter of a couple of days. And as I mentioned before, when you do that for that period of time, these groups become stable dominance hierarchies. One individual will be the top individual, meaning that when they interact with the other two, they tend to win fights. Another individual will be in the middle. They'll lose to the top-ranked individual most of the time, but they'll defeat the individual under them. And the third-ranked individual will be an individual who tends to lose all its fights. And what we want to know is there any relationship between these prior winner, loser, and neutral experiences and where you end up in the hierarchy? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. There seems that, one would think there might be, but no one had tested it before. So what I want to show you first is what individual ended up as the top-ranked individual in the group, the one that tended, on average, to win more fights against every one of its opponents than lose fights against that opponent. Now, if our experimental treatments, the winner, loser, and neutral, if they didn't have any effect on dominance hierarchy, since we had 18 fish, we would expect by chance that 6 of the ones that ended up as the top rank would be the winner, 6 of the ones that ended up as the top rank would be the neutral, and 6 would be the loser, if winner, loser, and neutral didn't matter. What you find, though, is that the individuals who had been experimentally given winner effects, a winning experience, they ended up at the top of the hierarchy much more often than chance. In 13 of the 18 hierarchies, the top-ranked individual was the one who had an experimental winner experience. And then when you ask the question with respect to who ends up at the bottom of the hierarchy, the worst position, you find the opposite, which is that 13 of the individuals were individuals who had experienced a loss before, and they were much more likely to end up at the bottom than you would expect by chance. Now, there is a sense in which you could say this is sort of what one would expect if winner and loser effects occur in species where there is a dominance hierarchy. You would think beforehand that there must be some implications of the winner and loser effects on the dominance hierarchy. Otherwise, why are they there? So what dominance hierarchies tend to do is they provide access to resources. So the top-ranked individual tends to be the one who has primary access to resources. The middle-ranked individual, not as much. The bottom-ranked individual has the least access to resources. So you would think that if there were winner and loser effects, they would translate into something in the hierarchy. And indeed they do, and indeed they do in the way that you would expect. But nobody had actually ever tested this before. And it could very well have been that this is not what happened, right? And then we would have to sort of sit back and say, okay, well, what do winner and loser effects really do in the long run if they don't do this? They do. They do this, but we didn't know that. So it looks like not only are the winner and loser effects in play, but they have a strong impact on where you end up in a hierarchy, and where you end up in the hierarchy is important in terms of getting resources. What I want to do now is think about winner and loser effects from a theoretical perspective. And in particular, I want to see whether or not these effects help us understand something that we've known about in nature for a very long time, but never really have been able to explain. And that problem goes like this. If you go out and you look at hierarchies in nature, and people have done this for dozens and dozens of different species, what you find are there are 2 basic kinds of hierarchies that you'll come across. One of them is what's known as a linear hierarchy. And a linear hierarchy is the kind of hierarchy that I've been talking about so far. It's one where every individual's position in the hierarchy is very clear. If you watch individuals fight long enough, you know who's the top ranked, who's the second ranked, who's the third ranked, and all the way down to the bottom rank. For example, people have studied this in chickens. Chickens were one of the first species where people looked at dominance hierarchies, and they have a very, very linear hierarchy. After they've interacted for a while, one individual clearly can defeat every other individual in the group. Then there's a second-ranked individual who beats up everybody except the top-ranked, all the way down. Wolves, something like that, not as strong, but something like that. And this is something you see in many, many different species, this kind of linear hierarchy. But there's another kind of hierarchy, and it's what's typically referred to as a despotic hierarchy, like in a despotic leader. And when you have a despotic hierarchy, like, for example, in some species of fish, like these sunfish, What that means is that when you watch those individuals interact in a group, and you're trying to determine what the dominance hierarchy is, it's very, very clear who's the top-ranked individual. But it's very difficult to figure out the ranks of the other individuals. So in this kind of hierarchy, what you tend to see is the top-ranked individual attacking everybody else and winning those fights. But you tend not to see a lot of interaction between all of the other individuals. And so it's hard to figure out what their rank really is. The only information you have about them, mostly, is that they lose to the top-ranked individual. But you tend not to have interactions between the bottom 3 individuals here, for example. And so it's very difficult to know what their rank is. And it's called the despotic hierarchy because you know who the despot is, you know who the top-ranked individual is. They beat up everybody else, but it's hard to figure out what the relationship between other individuals are because they just don't interact that much. For some work I did during my dissertation, we were working on these sunfish, and this is what we found. And it's frustrating when you're watching because everything is the same, which is everything is sort of the top-ranked individual is attacking somebody else. The top-ranked individual is now attacking a different one and now attacking another one. But the ones besides that, they don't interact very much, and so it's very hard to know what their relationship to each other is. You see this in nature as well. It's been difficult to try and understand what is it that might help us explain why some hierarchies are linear and other hierarchies are despotic. And so I thought, well, maybe this has something to do with these winner and loser effects. And so what I tried to do was build a simple model that asked, okay, if I simulate winner and loser effects using a computer simulation, and I look at the effect in the computer simulation on dominance hierarchies, is there any relationship between whether a winner effect is in play or a loser effect is in play, and whether we see a linear hierarchy or a despotic hierarchy, or any one of those things? So let me show you what I did. This was done a while back, and so the software is my son laughs whenever he sees the software I use for this. It's a simple computer simulation that was done in an older version of BASIC, and the idea is you're creating little cyber organisms, and you're going to let the cyber organisms interact with each other and fight, and you're going to look at the cyber hierarchies that come out of it, and you are going to see whether or not these winner and loser effects have any implication on what kind of hierarchy comes out, a linear hierarchy or a despotic hierarchy. So if it helps to think about this as, I'm going to be looking at groups of 4, and if it helps, you can think about 4 different chickens, and each one of those is color-coded, so so they're individuals that we're keeping track of in the simulation. It's 4 cyber individuals that we're keeping track of. And the way the simulation works is I start them all out with something that is their intrinsic fighting ability. So I'm going to say that they all, for example, are about the same size, and they have about the same strength and the same weaponry and all that. So I'm going to start them all out with the same fighting score. And you can pick any number you want, as long as it's the same for all the individuals. And that's sort of the amount of resources that they have to use to fight. And I just picked a value of 10 for all of my individuals, but you can pick any value you want. But everybody has that same value at the start of the interaction. It's the animal's estimation of its fighting ability based on size and condition and all those things we talked about. And then what the simulation will do is when you win a fight, if the simulation is looking at winner effects, so I turn on a little cyber switch that says, put winner effects on right now, and I'll show you what that means in a second. If I say winner effects are in play, then If you win a fight, you take that fighting score that you have of yourself, let's say it's 10 at the start, and you increase that. This is my way in the simulation of making it more likely that you win your next fight as a function of having just won. So now your estimation of yourself is bigger than 10. And I do the same sort of thing for loser effects, but the opposite way. But because I'm only looking at winner and loser effects, you never change your estimation of the fighting ability of anybody else. You're not learning anything about their fighting abilities. There's no bystander effects here. There's nothing like that. You don't change your assessment of others. They're the same size as they were before, the same strength as they were before. You don't change your assessment of them. You only change your assessment of yourself. And how you do that depends on whether we have winner effects or loser effects or both. So let me give you a more concrete example. We'll talk about all this. Suppose you have winner effects. After a victory, an individual raises its estimation of its own fighting score. So for example, if this happens right at the start of the simulation, I have two cyber individuals that I'm representing as chickens here. They start off, they each have an initial fighting score, FAS, fighting assessment score, of 10. Everybody has 10 at the start. Now, if these two individuals interact, and that one on the right, the blue one beats the green one, and I'll show you how the simulation determines that in a minute. But suppose that that's what the simulation says, that the blue one defeats the green one. Then the blue one changes its estimation of its fighting score. It used to be 10, and now it's something bigger. How much bigger depends upon what I make the winner effect. Okay, so I can make a very, very strong winner effect, or I can make a very, very weak winner effect. If I made the winner effect, for example, 10%, 0.1, then you would take your original score and you would multiply it by 1.1. And so your score would now be 11. If I wanted to make a really strong winner effect, I could make the winner effect 0.5, so that after you won this fight, you estimate your fighting score as 15 rather than 10. So that's a variable. Turns out it's not all that important, but it's a variable in the model. Now, if only winner effects are on, then the loser, the green animal here, does not change its estimation of itself. Because if only winner effects are in play, then only the winner changes its estimation of itself. If I build a model where I only turn on loser effects, then after a loss, you lower your estimate of your own fighting abilities. So now, if loser effects only are in play, then if the blue individual defeats the green one, then the blue one keeps its score because only loser effects are in play and it just won, so nothing has happened to it in terms of the winner and loser effects. But the loser, the green individual, lowers its score to something less than 10. And again, how much it lowers it is a function of how strong I make this L, or the loser effect, right? I can make it 0.1 so that it drops its score to 9, or I can make it whatever I want, and it can drop its score more. And if I want to have, let me just go back here. If I want to have winner and loser effects both in play, I turn on the switch in the simulation that lets me do that. And if this happens, then the loser does this, and the winner then would take its score and multiply it by 1 plus W. So I could put either of them on, or both of them on, or neither of the effects on. Any combination of them that I want. All right. Now, I said that, well, if the blue individual beats the green individual, then this happens. But how does the simulation determine that? How does the computer simulation determine who wins a fight? So the first thing that the simulation does is it determines whether or not you are going to get into a fight. And your decision rule there might be something like, be aggressive whenever you're interacting with someone who you assess to be smaller, to have a lower fighting score than you. So you have your own assessment of yourself, and that might be changing, but you have an assessment of yourself. You have an assessment of others. That never changes. That's always going to stay whatever it is, 10 in my case. If you assess yourself to have a higher score than them, one fighting rule might be fight then, but don't fight otherwise. Or you could have a rule that says fight whenever you're more than half as big as your opponent. Or fight only when you're twice as big as your opponent. You can determine what that fighting rule is and build it into the simulation. Now, once individuals make that determination, that's going to affect whether or not a fight happens. Okay, so the way the simulation works is you randomly pull two individuals out of your group, the blue and the green chicken, all right? And each one of them will decide whether or not it wants to be aggressive using that rule. So suppose their rule is, I'm only going to get into a fight if I'm bigger than the other individual. The blue individual, or if I have a better fighting score than the other individual. The blue individual will determine whether or not that's true. And then the green individual will determine whether or not that's true for itself. So after that happens, there's three possibilities. Both of the individuals decide that they're willing to fight. And then you have a real fight. You have two individuals who interact aggressively. What you might have is one individual who's assessed the situation so that it's willing to be aggressive and fight. And another individual who's determined it's not going to do that. It's not going to fight. In that case, you have the sort of computer cyber equivalent of one individual attacking and the other one retreating. The one that's attacking is the one that's decided it's going to be aggressive. The one that's retreating is the one that's decided it's not going to get into a fight. And the third possibility is that both individuals could determine they're not willing to get into a fight, and then there's no interaction. So now we've gone through two steps. First, each individual determines whether it's going to be aggressive. Then that translates into one of these three things happening. The second and third thing are easy to understand. The third thing, nothing happens. There's no aggressive interaction. The second point here, it's very clear what's happened. One individual has won that interaction. It attacks and the other one retreats. And so there's nothing more that we need to know about that. But we do still need to know what happens on point number one, when both individuals have determined that they're willing to fight. And there is a fight. What's the probability that you win that fight? We have to have a way to determine that. So the way that's determined is the probability that, for example, individual 1 wins a fight against individual 2 is individual 1's assessment of its fighting score divided by individual 1's assessment of its fighting score plus individual 2's assessment of its own fighting score. So if they have the same assessment, if each one assesses themselves at some value, 10 or 15 or 20, if each one comes to that same value, then the probability that individual 1 beats up individual 2 is just 1/2. If individual 1 has a higher assessment of its fighting ability score than individual 2, then that probability is going to be greater than 50%. How much more depends upon how much the difference in assessment is. And then, so the simulation then looks at those values and says, okay, if they have the same fighting scores, 1 and 2, and so that 1's probability of winning should be 50%, then it just picks a random value from 0 to 0.5, and if it's lower than that, from 0 to 1, if it's lower than 0.5, it makes 1 the winner. If it's bigger than 0.5, it makes 2 the winner. If individual 1 has a bigger assessment of its fighting score, let's say it should have a 70% chance of winning based on that fraction, then you simply pick a random value from 0 to 1, and if it's less than 0.7, then individual 1 is determined the winner, and if it's more than 0.7, individual 2 is determined as the winner. And the computer simulation keeps track of all of the information that we've been talking about. Then what you do is you tell the simulation, okay, I've got a group of 4 individuals, and I want there to be 500 interactions in my group. or I want there to be 50 interactions in my group, or whatever you want, okay? And so what it does is it'll go in and pick 2 individuals, do all the stuff we just said. And then it'll randomly go in and pick 2 more individuals. And if you tell it to do, you want 500 interactions, it'll do that 500 times. And every one of those, it'll take all the data that we just talked about. And it'll be keeping track of who's winning and who's losing. And it will pop out a matrix that you can use to determine the dominance hierarchy. So let me just give you a hypothetical example of what one of these matrices looks like so you know how to read it. Let's say we have individuals A, B, C, and D in our group. What you're seeing here is the interactions that A has with the number of times that A has defeated other individuals in its group. So if you go to the AA box, it can't interact with itself. If you go to the next box over, you see A defeats B 100 times. You see that A defeats C 50 times, and you see that A defeats D 160 times. So this is just data that comes out of the simulation. And then the simulation will tell you about B's interactions and how many times it's beat up everybody else in the group. And you might see something like, well, B beats up A 30 times. B beats up C 200 times, and B beats up D 158 times. This is just a hypothetical example. And then you can fill it in for C and D. So what this is telling you is how many times one of the individuals in this left column, if you go across, how many times it's beat up everybody else in the group. So what do we see in terms of the hierarchies that are produced by the computer simulation? So on my simulation, if I turn on the little button that says winner effects only, no loser effects, just winner effects, and I pick a winner value, like I say, well, if you win, make them 10% more likely to win the next time, or 20%, or whatever I choose. And I run this over and over again. What kind of hierarchy, dominance hierarchy, do I see? This is one example. So I might have one group and run it 500 times, and I might say, do this for 500 groups. This is just one example, one group that's interacted a bunch of times. But it's the same, you get the same pattern over and over again when you just put the winner effect on. The exact numbers are not the same, but the pattern is the same. And here's what you tend to see. There tends to be one individual who will defeat everybody else in the group much more than they're defeated by that other individual. So in this case, I've always made the top rank individual, I'm always making them A. So in this case, what you see is A is a top ranked individual because when it beats up B 146 times in that red box. B only beats it up 6 times in that other red box. A beats up C 172 times in that purple box. But C only beats up A 7 times in its purple box. And the same for D. A beats up D all the time in that little light blue box at the end, 160 times. But D only beats up A 2 times. So A clearly is the top-ranked individual. It wins way more often than it loses when it interacts with everybody else. Then there's an individual who's clearly the second-ranked individual. And I've just made that B to make it easy to see. B, we saw that B loses to A. So it's not the top-ranked individual. But it beats up C way more than C beats up B. It beats up C 198 times, but C only beats up B 9 times. And the same thing for D. B beats up D 158 times. D only beats up B twice. So B is the second-ranked individual. And the third-ranked individual, I've always made C just for illustration, because C beats up D way more often than D beats up C. And D is the bottom-ranked individual because it loses way more often to everybody else in the group than it wins against them. And again, if you run 500 different groups and get a matrix like this for every one of the groups, you tend to see this kind of pattern. The exact numbers in the matrix will be different, but you will get a clear top-ranked individual, a clear second-ranked, and a clear every rank. So it's clear where everybody is. It's a linear hierarchy. And most of the interactions that occur in this group when winner effects are on are real fights. Individuals have assessed themselves so that they're ready to go into real fights, and they have real fights. So you get very few attack retreats when only the winner effect is on. You get a clear linear hierarchy, and most of the interactions are real fights where both individuals are ready to be aggressive and are aggressive. Now, if you turn on just the loser effects but no winner effects, you tend to find something like this. Again, the exact values will be different every time for every group, but you get a pattern that's like this. And this pattern is a classic despotic hierarchy. In other words, it's very, very clear A is the top-ranked individual. It beats up B 156 times. B never beats it up. It beats up C 198 times. C never beats it up. It beats up D 174 times. D beats it up twice. But then, if you go to the rest of the hierarchy, it's really hard to say who is the second-ranked individual, right? I mean, B beats up C 3 times. C doesn't beat up B at all, but 3 times is really not much to make a determination of hierarchy position. B beats up D 3 times. D beats up B 2 times. You really can't say anything about position. All of the ranks, besides the top one, are unclear, because when any of the individuals, B, C, or D here, are chosen to interact with each other in the simulation, they opt not to be aggressive. And so they basically don't interact with each other. And that's why I'm getting zeros here. Basically, they will not interact. They consistently, when they're paired up with against each other, they choose not to interact. The only time I get any kind of interaction in the simulation when there's just losers is when the top-ranked individual interacts with somebody else, and they almost always win those interactions, the top-ranked individual. So there is a despotic hierarchy when the loser effect is in play, and most of the interactions in this kind of hierarchy are the attack-retreat interactions. They are the top-ranked individual attacking everybody else. You don't see many real fights where both individuals have opted to actually be aggressive. So simply by having only winner effects on or only loser effects on, I can mimic those two basic kinds of hierarchies that we talked about earlier. The winner effect, if it's only on, if that's all that's going on, that tends to produce a linear hierarchy. If the loser effect is on and nothing else, that tends to produce a despotic hierarchy. Now, if you tell the simulation, turn on both the winner and loser effects at the same time, interestingly, what you get is a hierarchy that is very much like if only the loser effect is on. You get a despotic hierarchy. It's very clear who the top-ranked individual is, and I'm always making that A just to make this easy to follow. But you don't know anything about the other ranks. So you get, again, a despotic hierarchy where most of the interactions are aggressive retreat, attack-retreat sequences. And that's true even though the value that was chosen for the winner and loser effects was equal. In other words, I said make the winner effect and the loser effect the same magnitude. When they're the same magnitude, what this is telling us is that the loser effect has a stronger impact on hierarchy formation, because we're seeing hierarchies that are like loser effect hierarchies even when winner and loser are both on. So if you make a general comparison, what you find is that in terms of the type of hierarchy, winner effects tend to produce linear hierarchies. Loser effects tend to produce despotic hierarchies, and winner and loser effects of the same magnitude also tend to produce despotic hierarchies. When it comes to what kind of aggression goes on, winner effects tend to produce fights. Loser effects tend to produce attack-retreat sequences. Right? And one of the things I love about this model is that in retrospect, I almost like hit myself over the head saying, of course, this would be what I got. But I didn't know that when I went in. But in retrospect, when I thought about it, I thought, OK, wait, let's think, why would I get this? Why would my simulation produce these kinds of results? And when I started analyzing it, it became very clear. Right? So what happens in a winner, when the winner effect only is on, nobody ever lowers their estimation of their own fighting ability. They only increase it or keep it the same. What that means is that, first of all, you're going to get lots of fights. Because everybody assumes that everybody else in the group has stayed at their initial fighting score, because you're not changing your assessment of them, you're only changing your assessment of yourself. And you're only changing the assessment of yourself up when the winner effect is on. So everybody's going to be willing to go into an aggressive interaction. That's why you get lots of fights. You get a linear hierarchy because what's going to happen by chance, they all start out at the same fighting score. But by chance, one of the individuals is going to get really lucky and win a few fights in a row at the start. And another individual is not going to get quite as lucky, and it's going to win some, but not as many as the first individual. And so on. And so you're going to get a very linear hierarchy. You're going to have individuals who really think they have high fighting scores, and others who think they have moderate high scores, and all the way down. When you put the loser effect on, everybody starts with the same value. By chance, some individuals are going to lose a couple of fights in a row fast. They are going to they're going to drop their assessment of themselves, and then they're not going to be willing to fight anybody else, because they're going to assume that everybody else's score has stayed the same. And now they assess themselves as lower than everybody else. It's only an individual at the start who by chance wins a couple of fights really quickly early on that is then going to be the top individual. It's not going to have lowered its score. Everybody else is going to lower its score just by chance because they would have lost a few fights early on. They're not going to be willing to fight the top-ranked individual. They're not going to be willing to fight each other. And so you're going to get the top-ranked individual chasing everybody else, and everybody else not interacting with each other. Yes?
If you start A,
I can't hear
once you establish the hierarchy, if you extract A, what happens then? Since all below A is not willing to fight.
Oh, do you ask what would happen if I took A out of the hierarchy? If I have not done that, I have not taken an individual out of the cyber hierarchy once I started it. What would happen, I think that it would almost be certain that you would still, nobody would interact with each other anyway in that case. We have done experimental work where we've removed a real top-ranked individual, or we've merged groups, so now there are two top-ranked individuals who both think they should be top-ranked, and we can look at that experimentally, but I haven't done that. I don't know. So let me finish up by talking to you a little bit about the sort of things that I think we need to do with this work, the model in particular. There have been probably a couple of dozen species now where people have looked to see whether winner and loser effects are on, or both are on, or both are in play, or neither are in play. And there are easily that many different species, probably more, that people have looked at dominance hierarchies in. But those tend to be two different groups of experiments. There are people that sort of look at dominance hierarchies, and then there's another group of people who look at winner and loser effects. And those groups have not sort of come together in any way yet that would allow us to test these models that we're talking about. So what I want to know is, okay, there are enough species out there in which there's only a loser effect but no winner effect, and only a winner effect but no loser effect, and both. that I could go and look and see, okay, in principle, do I see a despotic hierarchy when there are only loser effects in play? Do I see a linear hierarchy when there is only winner effects? Do I see a despotic hierarchy when they're both on? But we don't know, because those have been very, very different groups of researchers who have looked at those questions. So what we need to do is pick maybe a dozen species and look at winner and loser effects in those species, sort of confirm what we know from other work that's been done. Then we need to look at hierarchy formation in those same species, and then we can test the predictions of the model. This is, in principle, a very easy thing to say, to do. In practice, granting agencies, at least when it comes to me, do not want to seem to give me a lot of money to do this. And the reason is that if I'm going to pick a dozen species, so in a proposal I put in recently, I put a dozen species in, and I said, okay, well, I know I'm going to get all kinds of comments about how different the species are, so I picked only fish species. Okay. And I picked a dozen species where we know something about one of the two things, but not the other, so I was going to kind of look at both winner and loser effects and hierarchy formation in every one of those dozen species of fish. Still, what happens is there are so many other differences between those species of fish that basically what reviewers end up saying is you're never going to be able to control for all those other differences, right? There are differences across those species in terms of what kind of mating systems they have. There are differences in terms of exactly where you end up in the hierarchy is, where you end up in a hierarchy and how much of resources you get. There are all kinds of other differences. But I would argue that if these winner and loser effects are, if their impact on hierarchy formation is real and strong enough, I should be able to sort of work through all of that noise. But so far, I haven't been able to have the opportunity to do it. It's possible in principle, and so I would argue this is the kind of thing that needs to be done in the future. So I'm going to stop here, maybe take a couple of questions, and we can then take a quick break. And the next talk is going to be something totally and utterly different, which is going to be a fun adventure in the history of science that deals with what was the world's greatest naturalist and one of the first presidents of the United States getting into a massive argument about natural history and politics. So, thanks.